can do some religion today. Not just the old-time religion, but also some of the new-time religion as well. Alright, let's probably turn off this music though, because it's probably a copyright violation when I put it on YouTube. So let's just put a stop to that. Okay, alright. As much as it would be nice to have a soundtrack during most of this video, I figure I should focus here. Alright, let me get big, there we go. Today, coming at you, religion. Alright, so why are we going to talk about religion? Well, because this is we're talking about globalization, we're talking about culture, we're talking about place, and of course, one of the big things when we talk about culture, and one of the ways that culture is expressed is through religion. And also, religion is very, very different as you go from one place to another across this world. So, like for instance, this is a slide showing the different parts of the United States and the different major Christian denominations. And so one of the things that jumps out at you here is like the red down here is Southern Baptist, and you can see there's a big chunk of the U.S. that is predominantly Southern Baptist. You can see that there's some areas up here in the Northern Plains that are mostly Lutheran. You can see the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons over here in this part of the Intermountain West. And then you see a whole lot of Catholicism in these blue squares. Of course, one of the things this map doesn't really show is the differences between the way, say, Catholicism might be practiced in a Irish Catholic church in Boston versus, say, a Catholic church in southern Arizona that is predominantly Latino. And so there are some things that it doesn't kind of show, but it just gives an example that there are different kinds of, even Christian denominations, to say nothing of the other religions around. The one thing I can't figure out on this map is this little piece right here, which I believe is around White River Junction, Vermont, is other. And I can't figure out what other Christian denomination is big in that piece of Vermont. That's not listed here, but there's some other going on there as well. Another way that religion is very different across whole territories is that it is, religion as a cultural practice is different levels of importance depending on where you are. So for instance, as it shows here, the percentage of people who say they are very religious in the United States differs from places like Utah and parts of the South, which are, where religion is considered to be a more important part of life, to areas where it's, only less than a quarter of the population considers themselves to be very religious. And you can see the places that are actually not very religious is where we are here in New England. But that may give us a skewed view of just how important religion is in many of the other parts of the United States. Of course, this is also different in different parts of the world. So for instance, this map here is showing Europe, and this is a different question. This isn't how important is religion, but instead it's the percent of the population who say they believe in God. And you can see that in some places it's well over 80%, places like Romania, which is Catholic, and Turkey, which is Muslim predominantly. And then you can see areas where it's also considered to be pretty important in red here. And then you get all the way down to places where less than 20% of the population says they believe in God in places like Sweden. And so you have this pretty big switch from country to country in terms of what the importance of religion and God is from place to place. All right. So what we're going to do in this particular lecture, I don't have kind of the big main points the way I'd set up the political geography lecture. And part of that's because this is a shorter lecture. But there are a few things that I want to hit, and as you can see in the things around the announcement that I sent out for this section, there's a couple other videos that I want you to look at too. One on the Protestant Reformation, and one on the way in which Buddhism sort of evolved out of Hinduism. So to start off with, so let me back up a second. So there's just a few major points that I'm going to hit here in this video about what is religion, different ways we talk about it, some different ways in which religions spread across the world and diffuse, and also the way religions split. Those are kind of the main themes that we're coming up with here today. But first, definition of religion. And of course, this PowerPoint's on Canvas too, if you need to look back at these definitions. But the definition here is it's a social system involving a set of beliefs and practices through which people seek harmony with the universe and attempt to influence the forces of nature, life, and death. And so we're going to look really at how religion affects places, how they diffuse, how they're distributed across space. And also, religion is very important for the way in which particular places get marked as being sacred. Sacred spaces and places of pilgrimage where people go to kind of worship at these locations. And this is actually from the book, which I thought was kind of interesting. It says, it's important to keep in mind that practitioners of belief systems falling outside the mainstream object to being called cults. And it said that the term cult should be used with caution because it conjures images of mind control, mass suicide, and extreme veneration of a human leader. So I'll try not to use the word cult here today much. Things that have usually been considered cults would be like Heaven's Gate, which are the people that thought that there was a UFO behind a comet, and they all committed suicide because they were going to go for a ride on the comet. Jim Jones was a guy back in the 70s who had this commune down in South America that was mostly people from the United States. Went down there, and then they were up to some shenanigans, and when they got caught, they tried, well, I think they actually killed a U.S. congressperson who was trying to go see their commune, and then when they knew they were going to get caught, the entire cult committed suicide by drinking poison Kool-Aid. So anyway, people don't like using the word cult. Another more recent one, for those of you who have Netflix and find it interesting, this is on a group called Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Was a guy who had a cult in Oregon in the 1980s, and there's a great Netflix documentary, like mini-series about this particular cult called Wild Wild Country. And the reason I bring this up, because we're talking about cults, is that I actually used to go here as a kid. My mom was in that cult growing up, and so I actually spent some summers out there in that one, and let me tell you, it was weird. All right. But in terms of classifying religions, going back out to the big picture here, the first thing that we need to do when we talk about them is we kind of categorize them in a few different ways. And one of the first one is that some religions we talk about as being proselytic, which also means universalizing. In other words, these are religions that are seeking converts. So religions like Christianity and Islam, technically anybody can be a member of that religion, and these religions actively try to recruit people and to convert them to their faith. So in that respect, they're universal. Everyone could be in it, and they're trying to, and they proselytize, meaning they try and spread the word and get people to come in. But not all religions are like that. Some of them are referred to as ethnic religions, and this is religions that are identified with a particular ethnic group or tribal group, and you're not really looking for converts. So Judaism is an example of this, but also a lot of local religions associated with different groups that are kind of more place-based religions, like Native American religions, and other types like that, aren't necessarily seeking converts. There are also a couple other ways that we can talk about religions. One is based on how many gods the religion tends to worship. We have what's called monotheistic religions, where there's the worship essentially of one god, and polytheistic, which is a religion that has many gods. Another way we can also kind of classify religions is how much they tend to blend or take in elements of other religious traditions. So there are religions called syncretic religions, where they take strands of different religions and put them together. And so examples of this would be Sikhism, which is an attempt to kind of bring Islam and Hinduism kind of together into one religion. There's also Zen Buddhism and Shintoism in Japan, which takes in elements of Buddhism and kind of mixes them around. And that would be syncretic. Orthodox religions, on the other hand, are strands of major religions that emphasize purity. They don't want to mix with other religions or mix with kind of popular culture. They have a more strict adherence to a very defined set of principles, and they're not open to kind of blending or changing. And then connected to Orthodox is the term fundamentalism. Not only fundamentalist religions, Orthodox in that they don't want to change or blend, they also believe in going back to the original tenets or original texts or the original way of life of the people who started the religion, which could have been potentially thousands of years ago. So fundamentalism is this movement to return to the founding principles, which can include a very literal interpretation of the sacred texts, or the attempt to follow the ways of a religious founder as closely as possible. And typically fundamentalist groups tend to be really intolerant, not just of other religions, but of people even within their own religion who they don't think are being orthodox enough, aren't following the fundamental kind of traits of that religion enough, and so tend to be fairly inflexible. And of course, there are different fundamentalist groups by religion. There are Muslim fundamentalists, there are Christian fundamentalists, there are Hindu fundamentalists, and so this kind of goes across a lot of different religious groups. So one of the other things about religion is that they tend to start somewhere. And it says here, because religion, like all kind of aspects of culture, they have a strong territorial association. And the boundaries of formal religious cultural areas, like most cultural borders, are not really sharp. So like where one religion ends and another one begins is sometimes a little bit difficult to see, like on a map. I'm going to actually skip ahead here for a second to show you a map to give you an example. Aha! This is the map of different Muslim sects in the Middle East. So in dark green here, you have the Shia areas, and you have the more Sunni areas in kind of a yellow. And then you also have Wahhabism, which is here in the more blue. And the thing that this doesn't show is that a lot of these areas are actually quite intermixed with the different sects of Islam. But you can still try and draw these maps of where different groups predominate, but these borders are sometimes quite fluid, changing, and kind of intermix with each other. Just like when we looked at the map of the U.S., yes, we can see where Baptists predominate, but that doesn't mean there's not Catholics in those states too, and other religions as well. So, okay, let me go back. Okay, so when we talk about place-based religions, like all religions usually come out of some particular place. But there are some religions that really stay kind of bound to those particular locations, and there's a type of religion that we refer to as animism. And animism is where you have a religion that's associated with the idea that there are deities or sacred spirits or certain powers embedded within landscapes and other animals and other elements of the environment in a particular place. And so these can be different in different parts of the world. And they're just kind of given this blanket term of animism, but like the type of animistic religion you would get, say, in among Aboriginal folks in Australia would be very different from, say, Native American groups in the United States. But they all still have they share the fact that they are really focused on particular sacred spots and the spirits and powers that are believed to be in those areas. Another example of a very kind of place-based approach to kind of religious belief would be feng shui, which means literally wind and water in Chinese, and it refers to the practice of harmoniously balancing forces of nature within a place and a built environment. And so a lot of the concepts of feng shui are around how do you arrange your living space and the buildings to kind of connect with concepts of different energies and supernatural flows that exist throughout the place. And it dates back some 7,000 years, but people still talk about it and use its principles. Like one of the photos in the books, which I like, is this condo building in Hong Kong. And there's this big square that is put into the middle of the building because, in terms of, according to feng shui, it's to allow the passage of the dragon that lives in the hill behind it. If I ever live in a big building, I want to definitely have a window for the dragon. I think that's cool. Okay. The other thing about religion and place is that religious belief has a big impact on how people treat landscape. So it says here, every religion expresses itself in food choices, and so therefore certain plants, certain kinds of livestock are going to be in those areas or not. So like, for instance, in areas where Catholicism is quite big and there's ceremonies with wine, you get wineries. In some religious traditions, people don't eat pork, so you're not going to have a lot of pigs and areas set aside for for pork production. There are also certain taboos, like for instance, like against caffeine in Mormonism, or against tobacco in certain religions and things like that. So that's going to also have this effect on what kinds of things are grown and what the consumption patterns are. But kind of even more in a grander way, religion also affects how we interact with landscapes, because there's a lot of things in religious belief about how you're supposed to treat the land on which you're on. And there's this concept called eco-theology. Theology is sort of the study of religion, and eco, obviously, about the ecology. And this is the study of the influence of religious belief on habitat modification. So in some religions, the earth is there for human use, and humans are supposed to change it, do things to it, and do things that better human society for it. And also humans are considered to be kind of separate. But in other religious traditions, the natural environment could be considered to be actually not even really separate from human society, as more of a cyclical relationship, or even one where the environment is kind of paramount, and human society has to sort of bend to the will of the environment. And so because of that, different religious traditions will modify landscapes in very different ways. Okay. And then, you know, in terms of also like the importance of place in different religions, there's this video clip that I put in the assignments for this section about Jerusalem and Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and how there's basically a holy site that's holy to both Judaism and to Islam, and they're in the exact same place. And this video gets into the conflicts that come about because of that. So if you've had a chance to see that video, you can see that this is very contentious when two different religious groups think of the same site as having a lot of religious significance and then try to manage it as such. Okay. So another major point is that religions also move, right? They move around. So some places, some religions, all religions start somewhere, but then some of them move out and diffuse into other areas. And you get this concept of cultural hearth, which essentially a cultural hearth is a focused geographic area where an important innovation is born from and then spreads. And religions, interestingly, the major religions all come out of just a few different cultural hearths around the world. And so let me go to this map, which will show this a little better. So for instance, in the Middle East here, you have the origins of where Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all come out of an area that are fairly small, and so that's like a cultural hearth of those Western religions. You also have other major religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism that came out of this kind of cultural hearth here in India and then spread. And then you also have Taoism over here in China, which is a religious tradition which then spreads out from there. And so, you know, if you go back to the stuff we've done in this class around diffusion, basically all these religions are diffusing in all the different ways that we've kind of talked about in terms of relocation diffusion, hierarchical diffusion, and contagious diffusion. That's one of the ways that they move around. But some religions are easier for them to move around than others. Obviously, ones that are very place-based or ethnic religions don't tend to move as much, whereas ones that proselytize but also have written holy books, things that you can take with you, are religions that can have a better chance of moving and then getting converts in different places. As then today, if you look at a map of the whole world, you can see that there's lots of different, cultural regions that have different predominant religions. You can see that Christianity is big, of course, in Europe and also here in Latin America. These brown areas are animism, or animistic religions of various sorts. You can see Islam in green here with Shia in like a light green and Sunni areas in a darker green that predominate through North Africa and the Middle East. And then you see different forms of Buddhism that are really big over here in East Asia, and then Hinduism here in India. And so, this is kind of the religious mosaic that we get. Oh, and I should note, even though like Islam here is mostly in Middle East and North Africa, you'll notice that actually the country in the world that has the largest population, that is a predominantly Muslim country, is Indonesia. And the reason why this area is mostly Muslim has to do with Arab traders that came down through here across the Indian Ocean a long time ago. And so you have actually, Indonesia is actually one of the largest Muslim countries in the world. So if you actually look at the numbers in terms of percentages around the world, you can see that Christianity actually has the largest number of adherents, Islam a close second. Then you have unaffiliated or secular people that don't necessarily have a religious affiliation, Hinduism, animistic faiths, Buddhism. And one thing you'll note is that even though Judaism is quite popular religion here in the United States and in certain places, globally it's actually quite small. I mean, it's an ethnic religion, not a lot of converts, and is also very widely distributed because early in Judaism several thousand years ago, you had what's called the diaspora, where people in that area of Palestine where Judaism began, were essentially just forced to disperse around the world, and so you have small Jewish communities kind of all over the place, but overall numbers quite small. And then one other aspect of religion that's important is what's called pilgrimage, and this is the idea that many religions tell people that they should at some point go to these sacred sites of the religion. In Christianity, of course, some people will go to places like Bethlehem and other important sites in what they refer to as the Holy Land in Israel and Palestine. But also people will go to the Vatican. People that are Muslim will go on what's called a Hajj, which is a pilgrimage that every Muslim, if they are able, is supposed to go on at some point in their life, where they go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia and go on a pilgrimage. Interestingly, if you actually look at the history of tourism around the world, tourism actually started out from pilgrimage, where different people of different religions would go to these sacred sites, and then you started getting businesses that were catering to those travelers. And so that was sort of the introduction or beginning of really tourism as an industry. First, it was for religious purposes, and then later more for enjoyment or to become kind of more cultured or just to kind of learn about things and that kind of stuff. But really, tourism originates in this idea of traveling to go see a sacred site. And this is just a picture showing the Hajj in Mecca, where Muslim pilgrims have come to go on a pilgrimage in Mecca. But there are other important sites, parts of the Ganges River in India, the Bodhi tree, where the Buddha supposedly became enlightened, things like that. So a couple other points here. One is that religions, as I sort of mentioned with this idea of syncretic religions, sometimes religions merge. So religions like Sikhism or the way Buddhism and Shinto kind of come together a lot in Japan are examples of the ways religions can sometimes kind of come together or take elements from each other and combine. But what's even more common is that religions split. And so I talked a little bit here about the way Shia and Sunni Islam have split, and a lot of that actually has to go back to the time period not too long actually after Muhammad, when different groups of people had a disagreement about the way in which the leader of the religious faith should be chosen, whether they should be descendants of Muhammad or whether it should be basically somebody who's elected by the group. And so those groups kind of split off on that, although they're in terms of the way they practice the religion and things like that is not hugely different. But a lot of it goes back to this very early argument between the groups, several, over 1,000 years ago. And so you're not, you don't have to watch this video on Sunni Shia split, but I have it on here in the PowerPoint if you're interested. That kind of gets into kind of where that split comes from. It's a relatively short video. The one video that I am making you watch, however, is about a 10-minute video. It's a crash course in history video by a guy who talks even faster than me, if you can believe it, talking about the Reformation. And this was the major split in Christianity between the Protestant religions and the Catholic religions. And so when we looked at that map of the United States and we see groups like Baptists and Lutherans, these are Protestant religious faiths that are very separate from the Catholic Church. And to understand kind of the difference in these different religious faiths today, you have to go back to this time period of the Reformation. And so there's a video about that. And of course, there's also a discussion question kind of linked to that as well. Yeah. The other video that I want you to watch associated with this is another crash course video. And just so you know, those are the only 2 crash course videos we watch the rest of this semester. But they're good ones about religion. And so the other one is how Buddhism sort of came out of Hinduism and some of the major differences there. And the fact that Buddhism originates in India, however, is not really that popular of a religion in India. It got more popular in places like China and Southeast Asia, sort of as it spread out of India. But that video gets into that a little bit. In terms of the relevance of religion in today's world, well, definitely still is. This is a little bit dated, but as of 2012, a Gallup poll revealed that 69% of Americans consider themselves to be very or moderately religious, which makes the U.S. actually one of the more religious nations on earth. But as noted, the importance of religion varies from place to place. but also the percentage of Americans who do not have a specific religious identification, who kind of consider themselves to not really so necessarily be religious, that has also increased. And some parts of Europe, that's increased a lot too, and this is what's sometimes referred to as secularization, the fact that there's large numbers of people that don't identify with any particular religious faith. And then one of the other things that's been going on with religion, of course, associated with globalization, is that it's changed religion, because today you don't have to run into, in person, an adherent of a particular religion to find out what it's all about, right? You can get online and you can read the Bible, or you could read the Quran, or you could read some of the holy texts of Hinduism, or you could read Buddhist philosophers. And so today it's much easier to kind of get a broad view of different approaches to religion. But it also means that kind of, one of the things that's really at the core of many religions is gathering together, whether it's in a holy place or in a church ceremony. And, this idea that churches are supposed to be communities of people or communities of believers is something that, when religion kind of transfers itself onto the internet or into things like mass-marketed tele-evangelism or some of these other kinds of forms of worship that are not necessarily about kind of being all together in one place, there's some people that say that that's kind of shifts the real meanings of religion. But of course, it does have the advantage in times when people are under quarantine or things are kind of shut down, that people can still practice religion remotely. Yeah. All right. And then the last thing I want to mention here is, of course, when we looked at the video about partition with India and Pakistan, this is an example where people decided to take a country that was all essentially pushed together by the British and cut it into pieces based on religious faith, to put Muslims on one side of the line and to put Hindus on the other. And as you saw in this video, this was basically a complete disaster in terms of the numbers of people that were killed, the fact that it dislocated so many people, and also the fact that India and Pakistan to this day still don't get along, and also the fact that within India there's still tremendous oppression and repression of the Muslims that still live in India, which number in the millions and hundreds of millions in terms of numbers of Muslims that still live in what is today India. And they are been facing quite a bit of repression because the government that currently exists in India can be considered to be sort of a Hindu nationalist government that believes that that India, because the way it was formed, with Pakistan being the Muslim side and India being the Hindu side, that Muslims shouldn't be there. Right? That's the attitude of some of these Hindu nationalists, and so this continues to be a problem, largely because of the idea that when someone decided to draw a line and say, you on that religious faith over here, you over here, it didn't necessarily work very well, as we saw in the video and as we got into in the discussion questions. So, all right, that's it for this one. The next video we're going to get into is looking at global food systems. If you have any questions, of course, feel free, get in touch. All right, thank you.